I got a comment on a community tab thread I posted, which was asking for some questions of, basically video idea topics. And this was a good one, I thought, which is, what is the most overrated statistic in football? Now, if you know this channel, you know I talk a lot about numbers. I talk a lot about film too, but I always believe that you should have a blend of both. If you just pay attention to stats and don't watch the film, well, then you're not going to understand the context of certain things. But if you just watch film and don't look at the numbers, well, you might not be able to fully realize how consistent certain things are happening. I think when you're evaluating things at your best, you're using both things, but of course, there's a difference between just using numbers and using the correct numbers. So these are going to be the stats that I think that maybe not necessarily you shouldn't use, because one thing I always do like to maintain is that there's no such thing as a bad stat. That doesn't exist. Every stat is very good at telling you what it's supposed to tell you. The only way for a stat to be bad is if you use it in an improper way. Numbers do not lie, but you can use numbers to lie. A quick example of what I'm saying is, for example, passing yards. Passing yards is one of the first things I jump to when I talk about overrated stats. I mean, people will say, wow, a guy had, 300 yards in that game, but if they threw the ball 55 times, of course they're going to have a good amount of passing yards. That's not impressive. It actually would be not a very good number efficiency-wise. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that the passing yards stat itself is, a bad stat in terms of again, it tells you, how much they relied on throwing the football. You just need more context to really understand what's happening. Passing yards is definitely one where, that bulk stats in general can be very tough. And that's something that I tend to just avoid altogether in terms of talking about how good a player is. Because at the end of the day, I think when people say bad stat, what they really mean is a stat that doesn't actually help you figure out who is or isn't a good player. Bulk stats are the first thing that jump out to me. Things like, touchdowns, interceptions, which those can be kind of good because you can use them, compared to each other. But touchdowns, interceptions, passing yards, and especially with other positions, it tends to be a little tough, like running backs as well. A lot of it comes down to just volume. How much did you throw the ball? How much did you rush the ball? Because if you throw the ball a lot, you're going to have more passing yards. And if you're losing in games, you're going to have more passing yards. There's never been a team win the Super Bowl with a quarterback who threw for the most yards in the regular season. I mean, that's just never happened and probably never will, because when you're losing, you're more likely to throw the ball more. So better stats, if you like using passing yards as a stat, I would probably recommend using yards per attempt. I think it tends to be a better stat. Or just, when you look at passing yards per game in and game out basis, make sure you just at least also look at the attempts. That's just personally what I do. And I think, when you use those stats, it can help get you a better indication of how good of a job the quarterback actually did at pushing the ball down the field. Another stat I think is definitely flawed is interceptions in general, just because there's so much luck based into it. So again, it's one of those things where it's like, okay, yes, technically if a quarterback threw 15 interceptions, that's how many times they did it. But again, what is it telling you? It's just telling you the interceptions. It's not telling you what, how bad of a job the quarterback did at protecting the football. That it doesn't actually perfectly tell you, although it tends to go in line with that. Something like a turnover-worthy play stat that PFF has, I think is a much better way to use that, and that's something that I would prefer. So again, these are stats that people use that I think that there's still better, albeit still flawed, but less flawed stats that I would use instead. Another thing that this is going to be maybe a hot take, because I think we kind of agree with those ones, right? I think most people agree, yeah, passing yards is heavily flawed. Yeah, interceptions can be flawed. I think where we maybe would disagree is something like EPA, I think it's something that's used in the analytic community a lot. If you don't know what it is, it's estimated points added, typically on a per play basis of, what would the what would the point expectancy be on a very specific situation, and after that play, how did that play affect point expectancy, which I actually think for a team perspective is a very good way to measure that stuff, although I still prefer points per drive, because that's the main goal is, on a per drive basis, not on a, per play basis, but it's still a very good stat that way. But people use it a lot for quarterbacks, which, again, there's no perfect stat for quarterbacks. It's not the worst stat to use, but I think people kind of view it as almost like this catch-all perfect stat, which it just isn't. It's just not. There's plenty of flaws in EP. It's so team dependent is what I should say. So that's a stat I would say isn't a bad stat, but a misused stat at times. It is a team stat, not an individual player stat. And you could certainly argue the same with passer rating. It's a team stat. You know, if a wide receiver catches the ball 10 yards down the field and then runs the rest of the way for a touchdown, they get the credit for this. And this is kind of why I go back to you have to watch the film and look at the numbers, because if you've watched the film and then you see that the passer rating was very good and actually, maybe a little better than you remembered, as long as you don't think back and say, well, oh yeah, that was just because of that one play that they got lucky on, then you're going to say, okay, well, maybe I was too harsh. Maybe it actually was good. But if you watch the film and the passer rating was good, but you're like, well, no, you just, like a good example is Christian Watson had a play where, Jordan Love threw it to him for like 15 yards down the field. Watson ran the rest of the way for a touchdown. I feel like since that moment, people have brought up like, wow, Jordan Love, he was actually really good in that game. Look at his passer rating in that game, in which you can say, well, no, he had that one play. But if he didn't have that one play, then that stat would be a good stat. So again, it tells you what it's supposed to tell you, but sometimes added context can make these things a little flawed. One thing where things get a little interesting, and probably my favorite stat to use still is a Pro Football Focus grade, which I know is not everyone's cup of tea. But to be honest, I think sometimes part of why people don't like PFF grades is it tells them things they don't want to hear. Tampa Bay fans hated PFF because they were mean on Devin White. But then, as the kind of time goes on, they're kind of like, yeah, I guess you were right about that one. That was how I viewed it, is I used to write off PFF stats until I would go back and watch the film from that game that they graded a player I thought played well poorly, and I kind of say, okay, I kind of get it. I do understand what's going on. So how do you evaluate a player then? I basically said every stat is flawed, which it is. And I think that the best way to evaluate players is to understand how stats are flawed. And even in PFF grades, like a PFF quarterback grade, I think gives too much credit to the game managers, not enough credit to the playmaker type quarterbacks. But because I know that, because that's how I feel it is flawed, then I know how to use that, and I can use it with the context. At the end of the day, which stats should you use? All of them. You should look at every single stat, and you should watch film if you really want to evaluate a specific player. Now, to that, you might say, yeah, listen, I work a job, and I don't have time to spend, 20 hours a week figuring out which offensive linemen are actually good. Okay, fine, I get it. But then hopefully you just find a content creator, I hope it's me, but if it's not, that's fine, who you trust and you value their opinion and you listen to what they have to say. Or just, my recommendation, if you're not going to do that, just look at PFF grades. That tends to be I would say, the best stat if you're just going to look at one. But I think that, plenty of stats have flaws, but again, worth mentioning that, I always think about the difference between, one last comparison before I end this video is, which apparently you're not supposed to say that you're about to end a video, that like hurts retention, but whatever, who cares about retention? It's the off season anyway. The example I always give is in baseball, there was a stat called batting average. How often do you get a hit? Well, eventually they realized, hey, on-base percentage is kind of a more accurate representation of figuring out how valuable a player is. How much, just not necessarily how often do you get a hit, but how often do you get on base, whether it's with a walk or a hit or, another way. Does this mean that batting average was a flawed stat? No, it still tells you how good you are at getting a hit. It's just that there's a stat that more accurately tells you, how good you can be and how valuable you can be in the sport. And so that's a better stat to use. Doesn't make it, so it's a weird distinction to make, and maybe no one cares, but I think it's an important distinction to make so people don't just write off stats altogether. They just understand that, no, all stats require added context. So yeah, those are my thoughts. What are yours? Let me know in the comments below. Always love hearing from you. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.